of biological diversity, and prior informed consent. Also in benefit sharing. I think with genetic resources, as I mentioned, use, but again, we also want to benefit from whatever use comes out from that genetic resources. Intellectual property rights related to genetic resources would protect and enhance Oman's assets. We don't want to be in this situation where not only for traditional knowledge, but also genetic resources, and we're walking through and everything is patented, and we have access to nothing. So we need to also be involved in protecting our own genetic resources and in traditional knowledge. By protecting and studying our Oman's genetic resources, this will lead to a lot of economic benefits. If we invest in our genetic resources, plus transfer knowledge and technology, which could be a part of benefit sharing, this would increase productivity, robustness against diseases, and lead to sustainable agribusinesses, benefits to the local populations. It will lead to social benefits and poverty reduction, preservation of local communities and cultures as well. In Oman, we don't have a national database as such in terms of the plant genetic resources, but we are utilizing the National Plant Genetic Resource Database for Food and Agriculture. It uses the National Mechanism Portal and databases on the conservation and sustainable use of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, which was established by 64 countries worldwide, with the participation and contribution of more than 1,000 public institutions, non-governmental and private organizations, including farmer associations from the plant genetic resource, food and agriculture world community that are involved in conservation, monitoring, multiplication, improvement, exchange of genetic resources. The aim of this database is to improve the ability of countries to make decisions about plant genetic resources, including establishing objectives, defining needs, and allocating resources, building stronger partnerships among stakeholders in plant genetic resources management within each country. Also to increase the understanding by stakeholders in each country about the status of their plant genetic resources. It increases the ability of countries to monitor changes in the status of their national, regional, and global levels, and enhance the capacity of countries to meet international reporting obligations. There is a need for a national database. Currently, we're utilizing international databases, so they need to have an inventory of what we have in the Sultanate. There are many databases in Oman, as I mentioned. There's a lot of work on conservation of biodiversity. Those are amongst many organizations, and some of them have databases that they use for their own personal use. The Ministry of Regional Municipality, Environment and Water Resources, they have two databases for marine turtles and for animals, and this is for their own use. The National History Museum, they possess databases for insects, animals, and shells. The Environment Society of Oman, Whale and Dolphin Research Group also have a database. Sultan Qaboos University has a database of the herbarium of plants and also for birds. So you can see that in terms of documenting genetic resources in Oman, we're really at an infant stage, I can say. So a lot needs to be done in terms of documenting it and also in terms of protecting intellectual property rights. We have a lot of constraints, and that's what is blocking us from progressing in terms of documenting and also in the area of intellectual property rights. There's a lack of coordination. There are many organizations, but little communication takes place amongst those organizations. Lack of information sharing, so each organization keeps that information for their own use. They do not share this information with other organizations as much, unless requested. The infrastructure is not there yet, and also the human resources are limited in terms of areas of database management and data collection. Also financial constraints. There are some databases that have been initiated but then had to be stopped because of financial constraints to keep up with the update of those databases. So we are moving forward. We've done a lot of work, but more needs to be done in terms of documenting genetic resources. Last year, His Majesty mandated the Research Council to establish a center for animal and plant genetic resources. And we've been working on the strategy of this center and trying to establish this, because as I said, there are many stakeholders, and we had to discuss with all the stakeholders to find out what would this center do. And that center's vision is to sustain human well-being and wealth creation through description, conservation, characterization, and use of Oman's genetic resources. Its mission is to promote the recognition, exploitation, and valuation of genetic diversity inherent in its animals, plants, and microorganisms as a natural heritage resource. The goals of this center are proposed to be documentation, again, very important, so hopefully this would unify the databases that are in the different organizations, so we'd have a national database. Conservation, we need to protect the genetic resource, that the information we're putting there, we need to make sure that those genetic resources are available to be utilized. There's a lot of research that needs to be done. Hopefully the center would also take a leading step in conducting research in the area of genetic resource conservation. A lot of capacity building, as I mentioned, human capacity is lacking, so there's a lot of work to be done on building capacity, coordination and advice, and then again, focusing heavily on utilization of these genetic resources, providing services to the community, and encouraging people to actually utilize those genetic resources and come up with new inventions or innovative ideas in utilizing these genetic resources, and encourage foreign investment on the genetic resources in the Sultanate. In conclusion, I'd like to say that Oman has unique and diverse genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. It should be protected and valued, and it's our legacy for the future and our wealth for the present. Thank you.
شكرا دكتورة نادية. أعتقد أنه الجمهور كان مستمتع اليوم بالمعلومات الجيدة والوضع الحالي لسلطنة عمان والوضع المستقبلي في ظل توجه السامي بوضع استراتيجية للموارد الوراثية. أتمنى أنه نادية أتمنى لها التوفيق وأنها الله يساعدها، لأن المهمة صعبة والمهمة بس أعتقد أنه البداية جيدة، ونتمنى التوفيق للجميع. معنا الحين طبعا خلينا نادي الأسئلة بين هذا. الحين ننتقل من عمان إلى البيرو. أعتقد أن احنا الحين في حاجة لنستمع لواحد لوير على الأقل يكون شوية هذا حقوقنا وين تروح بعد ما هذه نحفظ أو نوثق مواردنا. عندنا طبعا من الخبرات الجيدة واللي شاركنا الحين من بيرو لمستر مانويل. He's a lawyer since 1990. اشتغل كثير في موضوع الانفيرمنتال لو، وله خبرات كثيرة في التدريب والبحوث والمشاركات والاستشارات. يعمل حاليا كمدير وباحث رئيسي في CBDA في بيرو. نتمنى انه الاستفاده منك في يضيف اضافه جيده بالنسبه لنا للجلسه الطيبه هذه. تفضل دكتور.
Thank you, President. First of all, I'd like to thank WIPO and BASI for the possibility and the opportunity of coming to Oman for the first time and sharing with you some of the experiences which we have had in my country, Peru, in regards to protecting traditional knowledge related to biodiversity, and especially talking a little bit about the experiences we have had over the past few years in trying to document traditional knowledge and register and database traditional knowledge. I want to take you a few thousand kilometers from here to my country, to Peru, which is located in South America, on the western side of South America, bordering with Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile. My country is probably, in fact, it is the second largest Amazon country in South America after Brazil. We are a mega diverse country. We have a very high concentration of biological diversity, which is reflected in being a center of origin and diversity of potatoes. Potatoes as a crop were originated in Peru in the Andean region. We have over 3,000 varieties of registered potatoes and a series of Andean roots and tubers which are especially important for food security of our local communities. We are also a center of diversification of other crops such as maize, tomatoes, chilies, etc. There are over 4,000 species of plants with proven uses, which are actually being utilized by Peruvian communities. We are a center of origin of Andean camelids, and we have over 25,000 species of vascular plants, 500 species of mammals, over 1,500 species of birds, and we have, again, one of the most important fisheries in the world. We are also home to a great number of indigenous cultures, ethnic groups, which I will talk about in a while, and approximately 35 to 40% of our population is indigenous. This is just a picture of our coastal region in Peru. We have an Andean mountainous region which cuts through Peru from north to south, part of the Andean mountain range. And we have a very extensive tropical Amazonian forest. And so we have a series of very diverse ecosystems which give way to the country being, as I said before, one of the maybe 10 or 15 most diverse, biological diverse countries in the world. As I said, there's approximately 65 different ethnic indigenous groups in Peru, two of which are located throughout the Andean region, the Aymara and Quechua groups, and then there's dozens of Amazon native communities which are located throughout the Amazon region. As you can see, we have a very important indigenous population, and of course that's related to a lot of culture and traditional knowledge, which, as you will see, is very important in terms of conservation and use of biodiversity. These are some examples of just a sample of our indigenous peoples. The little girl on the left-hand side of the slide is dressed in typical Andean, the mountain region traditional dress, and the other two gentlemen are indigenous peoples from our Amazon region. Traditional knowledge in Peru is expressed in similar ways as happens in India and I'd say Oman as well, in terms of traditional cultural expressions which are reflected in traditional foods, designs, dances, arts, different forms of crafts. And traditional knowledge is much more related to the actual use and utilization of components of biodiversity for a wide range of purposes, including, of course, medicinal purposes by our communities. Traditional knowledge also relates to the use of biodiversity components as skin lotions, seeds of a very wide variety, and it's also reflected in knowledge related to technological uses of the land, of the general landscape, environment, agriculture, technologies and techniques, etc. Here are some examples of our medicinal plants, a medicinal plant plot on the left-hand side of the slide. And on the right-hand slide, right-hand of the slide, you can see a traditional shaman preparing some sort of medicinal pottage in the Amazon region, surrounded by some local community members. That's more or less a typical picture which you will find in the Amazon region of Peru. But just as we have traditional knowledge which is related to medicinal plants and to traditional ancestral uses and applications of traditional knowledge, we also have an important sector, commercial, industrial sector, which is or has been over the past maybe 2 or 3 decades using many of these plants and biodiversity components with traditional uses by communities in the development of a series of products which are currently in the market. Many of these products are nutraceuticals, botanical medicines, skin lotions, pills, etc., etc. Here's just some examples of what you can find in any pharmacy in Peru. These are products which have been developed from native biodiversity, and this is a very successful business, which, as I said, over the past few decades has been being undertaken by a series of national companies. So that's more or less the general picture of my country, some of the things which are happening there. And now I want to just very briefly touch upon some of the more legal and maybe policy-related aspects of traditional knowledge and how we have over the past few years developed a series of policy and legal frameworks to try and protect traditional knowledge. Probably we started discussing the protection of traditional knowledge in the early 90s, almost in parallel with the negotiations of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which you probably all know. We were also discussing in the region the development of plant breeders' rights to protect new varieties of plants. And throughout that discussion, the potential of traditional knowledge to contribute to the development of new plant varieties was put on the table. And so as part of that discussion, a process was initiated in 1993-94 to develop national rules regarding access to genetic resources, to the genetic patrimony and biodiversity components of the country. And this included specific calls for the protection of traditional knowledge related to this national biological patrimony. Of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity was an important trigger to stimulate policy debates and legal discussions in the country to try and find ways in which to effectively implement some of the general principles which the Convention on Biological Diversity presented, such as prior informed consent, benefit sharing, mutually agreed terms. These were presented in very general terms, and we had to try and interpret them to incorporate them into our national legislation. So, as of the 1990s, there has been a very strong legal process in Peru where we have, as I said, developed a series of policy and legal frameworks which include, as I said before, legislation on access to genetic resources, a general biodiversity law, a general biodiversity strategy, regulations for the protection of traditional knowledge, and I'll talk about this in a little while. So that's just so you have an idea of what the policy context is or has been in my country. This policy and legal context has been also accompanied by some projects, important projects, and efforts and experiences to try and implement in a way the principles, the general principles of the CBD and existing legislation in Peru. One important project which, again, generated a lot of discussion and debate in my country was the ICVG project, which was a project sponsored by the National Cancer Institutes from the US, which involved, in very general terms, collecting medicinal plants from Amazonian communities to find potentially useful active components to combat a series of illnesses, including cancer. This was a project which involved the collection and the systematization of traditional knowledge of communities related to biodiversity in the Amazon, to medicinal plants. And I'd say an interesting milestone from this project was the development of, I would say, probably the first contract and what we called at the time a know-how license for the use of the traditional knowledge. The company involved in this project, which was a subsidiary of Monsanto, at the time Searle Pharmaceuticals, which has now disappeared, but at the time a contract, a license, was negotiated by this company with native Amazonian communities in which conditions were established and set for the use of that knowledge in the research and development process. Some royalties were agreed, and the basic conditions for how this knowledge could be used and for what purposes were incorporated into this license agreement. And so that served as an important effort to inform the policy and the legal processes which were at the time, as you can see, early 90s, being undertaken in the country. There was another important project at the time. This was a GEF-funded project regarding the conservation of native crops and wild relatives in Peru, especially potatoes and Andean tubers. As I said earlier on, Peru is the center of origin of potatoes and of a wide range of other Andean tubers and roots. And so the idea was basically to find ways in which we could ensure that farmers, small farmers, especially in the Andean communities, in the Andes, would conserve in in situ conditions their very broad genetic diversity, find appropriate incentives to ensure that farmers could continue conserving these crops. And as part of that project, there was, with the participation of national institutions, universities, etc., a process of collecting the knowledge of farmers related to these crops and documenting and databasing this knowledge, basically. An important milestone, I guess, in this process was a WIPO fact-finding mission in 1980, which was starting to explore the possibilities and options for the protection of traditional knowledge. Peru was one of the countries that the WIPO mission visited, and after this, well, the whole IGC process was initiated. So I think that's important. Some other important projects and experiences, the potato park is an area in the central Andes of Peru where there's a very high concentration of potatoes, a wide range of varieties of potatoes which are maintained by local farmers, ancestral farmers in this region. And these farmers have developed a very interesting tool. It's a local traditional knowledge and biodiversity register, which has been developed by these farmers. It's maintained and administered by farmers. It's an interesting experience because women farmers in this area, in the Cusco area of Peru, use videos to document how conservation activities are undertaken in the potato park, the different techniques that their farmers are using to maintain traditional varieties, the use of medicinal plants and how these are conserved in in the agricultural plots. And this information is documented, databased, and managed by communities for a series of purposes, including raising awareness among the young people, having a database which effectively maintains in a tangible form traditional knowledge which has over time evolved. So that's another important experience. Peru developed in 2001 Law 27811, which is a specific law for the protection of traditional knowledge. It's probably one of the few existing examples of specific legislation targeted at protecting traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. And it includes, within its different provisions, the possibility of developing traditional knowledge registers at different levels, at the national level and at the local level. And we'll see a little bit more about this in 1 minute. Our National Intellectual Property Office, which is in the copy, actually manages the National Public Register for Traditional Knowledge and a National Confidential Register for Traditional Knowledge. Both are registers which are recognized in the law I just mentioned. One is for traditional knowledge, which is already in the public domain, documented in some form, and the confidential register is a confidential register which maintains knowledge which indigenous peoples considered should be kept secret by the national authorities for maybe defensive purposes or for the use by patent authorities to examine prior art, etc., without disclosing to the wider public the knowledge which is in this database. So, as I said, these databases, which are maintained by our National Intellectual Property Office, are basically for defensive purposes only. There's a couple of questions, I think, which we should consider when we are in the process of thinking about databasing and registering traditional knowledge, whether it's traditional cultural expressions or traditional knowledge. I think that there are certain elements, common elements there that we should consider. One clear question which I think we need to consider is, what is it we want to register traditional knowledge for? What's the objective we are seeking with a documentation process or a databasing process? What is it exactly that we want to document? A very important question is, at least in my country, from the experience of the Andean region countries, is, well, who's the owner of the traditional knowledge? Is it an individual community? Is it a series of communities? An indigenous peoples group as a whole? And that brings to the discussion, well, the role of prior informed consent and who provides consent for the potential use of that traditional knowledge. How will the registration or databasing process take place? And whether or not the documentation of traditional knowledge involves the recognition of specific rights over that knowledge. Is it a register or a database which effectively constitutes specific